Hi, folks. Thank you for joining us for our the second of our candidate webinars in our series. Today, we're joined by Karen Rosenberg from the Disability Rights Center. We're going to give people just a couple minutes to join us. And while we wait, I will quickly go over what the format of the webinar will be for today. So, like I said, we'll give folks a couple minutes to join. Um, I'll turn it over after that to Zach just to talk a little bit about the candidate webinar series itself. And then Karen will give a about 20-minute presentation followed by a presentation by Zach for about the same length. And the way that we'll be doing Q&A is through the chat. So as you have questions throughout the presentations, if you would like to put a question in the chat, I will take a note down and we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end where I will read those off for Zach and Karen. Um, and we do have closed captioning enabled. If that is a resource that you need, it's in the bottom. It should be in the bottom right of your of Zoom. And if you just click show captions, the captions will pop up. Um, we will be emailing around the recording and the slide decks following the presentation today. So as long as you registered and got the link through an email from us, you'll get the materials following this meeting and they'll be on our website as well. And yeah, with that, I think, Zach, I'm going to put you in the spotlight and turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Casey. Thank you everyone for being here for second webinar in this series. Really excited to be joined by Karen from the Disability Rights Center. This is just a list of all of the webinars in the series over the next few weeks. For anyone who's not here on Tuesday, these are nonpartisan, informational webinars. They're targeted towards candidates that for folks running for office, but they're open to anyone. And really, just if you want to learn about these issues that a lot of these organizations are experts in facing New Hampshire. We hope to kind of give you a little taste of them. We're only going to be able to get through so much in 20 minutes. So I really hope that people also take away from this that there are a lot of really incredible experts on a whole range of issues all around the state. And they have a ton of resources and can answer a lot of questions. So I hope that people also will take the opportunity to follow up with Karen if you want to learn more about her work or the work she talks about through the Disability Rights Center. Same for us here at the School Funding Fairness Project. Yeah, with that, I'll stop sharing, kick it over to Karen so she can get started with her presentation.
Perfect.
Hi, everyone. I'm hoping that this is going to work. It seems to shut down a little bit. Let's see what I can do here. Give me 1 minute. For some reason, this format is not wanting to be good for me, but let's see what we can do here. All right, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
But not in the way I want it to, right? Let's try again.
Right yet. There
How
you
about
go.
that?
Yes, looks good.
It looks good. Hooray. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for your interest in the Disability Rights Center. I'm Karen Rosenberg. I'm the policy director here at Disability Rights Center, New Hampshire. Actually worked here for about 19 years, most of which I was a senior staff attorney, and I've been in the policy director for the past several years. I want to tell you what the Disability Rights Center is, because not a lot of people really know. In fact, I didn't even know when I started working here. We are the state's protection and advocacy system for people with disabilities. And every state has a protection and advocacy system. We were started back in the 70s when the investigative reporter, who some of you might remember, Geraldo Rivera, really pushed out to the public eye some terrible conditions that were occurring at a facility in New York called Willowbrook, where people with developmental disabilities and other disabilities were being warehoused in horrific conditions, far exceeding the bed capacity for that facility by thousands. And this was really illustrative of what was going on across the country. I mean, you may also know about New Hampshire's kind of sordid history involving Laconia State School, where we were housing over 1,000 people with developmental disabilities in terrible conditions beginning in the early 1900s and continuing until around 1991. So when Geraldo Rivero exposed this, um, what happened was there were some lawsuits and congressional hearings on this, and ultimately Congress passed legislation to establish the protection and the advocacy system for initially for people with developmental disabilities, but then for people with all kinds of disabilities. And the idea was that the system would be an independent watchdog organization, separate from the state government, separate from federal government. So we are a nonprofit, independent, and also it entrusted the system with special authority to go into facilities and other programs that serve people with disabilities to do a couple things: monitor just conditions generally and tell people about their rights, but also to investigate allegations of abuse or neglect in facilities. And we also have authority to advocate for people. So we're a law office. So we provide free legal services to people who have disabilities about issues involving their disabilities. We might help them with some legal advice. We give some support to enable them to be better self-advocates. We provide legal representation in all kinds of forums, administrative and court proceedings. And we even represent folks in class actions and other kinds of systemic litigation where we're trying to address an issue or a problem or a violation in the law that affects a lot of people. To be eligible for our legal representation or for our services in general, person needs to be a New Hampshire resident. Like I alluded to earlier, the issue that they would be seeking assistance or that we could give assistance with has to be related to their disability. So, for example, like anyone could get divorced, regardless of whether they have a disability. But so that wouldn't be the kind of case we would take. But you need to have a disability to have a claim for housing discrimination based on disability, or a right to education in the public schools because of a disability. So those are the kinds of cases that we might take, or Medicaid eligibility for community-based services based on having a disability. We're a statewide program. We serve people of all ages. And as you see, there's a link in the PowerPoint that will be shared. You can get to our website and look, in greater detail if you're interested about what kinds of cases we take. Of course, we do not have unlimited resources. So when we're contacted by a potential client, if we're looking at something beyond some legal advice that's really specific to their call, we need to, and we're looking at maybe some kind of limited representation or full legal representation, then we need to consider things like our capacity, whether the case has legal merit, does it fit within our priorities, would our involvement make a positive difference for the person with a disability? Sometimes people can advocate for change on their own and don't necessarily need a lawyer. We also, as I mentioned earlier, because of our special authority, we conduct monitoring visits at a lot of the programs and facilities that serve people with disabilities throughout the state. And we also conduct investigations of abuse and neglect. So few things. As far as our monitoring goes, we have an institutional monitor who visits about 20 facilities every month. There are over 300 hospitals, nursing homes, group homes, treatment centers, emergency shelters, things like this, in schools, residential schools, assisted living facilities in the state where New Hampshire citizens with disabilities live. And because those systems and programs tend to be pretty closed, people can be very isolated, and that's why it's really important that organizations like ours get in to meet with people and just make sure that their rights are not being violated, and if there's any issues that we can help them to address them. Um, One thing that we are in the process of doing is developing a website so that all of you and members of the public will be able to get information about the facilities that our citizens with disabilities are residing at. And it'll be like a central hub to be able to look at results from any investigations we might have done, any licensing reports, um, or just to get a feel for what the facility is. So something to look. It's not done yet. I think it's projected to be done in the next 6 or 7 months. I've also listed some of the facilities, the top two that we've done some investigations of suspected abuse or neglect. So about maybe it's around 10 years ago now, I led an investigation into a death at Lakeview Neuro Rehabilitation Center. And we uncovered a lot of systemic problems there where people were being subjected to restraint, seclusion, not getting appropriate education services, not getting appropriate medical treatment. Ultimately, the facility was shut down. They lost their license. I think I'm probably talking too much. So I'm going to skip ahead. Other programs we run, we have a grant from the Social Security Administration to review how representative payees who are responsible for the Social Security funds of people who can't manage those funds on their own, how they are managing those funds. And so we meet with beneficiaries of Social Security who have representative payees, and we also look at very deeply into rep payee records to make sure that they are acting appropriately with their, in concert with their fiduciary obligations. We do education and outreach, educating policymakers and policy advocacy, which is a lot of what I do now, and voting rights. I'll talk more about our policy work, but I just want you to know that we also have a lot of resources on our website. So drcnh.org, there is more information than you could possibly imagine. If you click through our issue areas, you can get information on voting rights, employment rights. There are videos, there are fact sheets, there's all kinds of information about disability rights issues. I've highlighted this disability language guide because one of the things that's really important in our office is ensuring that we are always being as inclusive as possible and responsive to the needs of people with disabilities. And one thing that has become really clear to us is that language can really be hurtful and also not respectful. And so we are really trying to make sure that we educate folks about that more broadly, and that we ourselves make sure that we are not, that we basically, respect how people want to be referred to. We try not to use euphemisms like differently abled or special needs to refer to someone with a disability, because we all have our own needs, and people with disabilities are people. These are some of our priorities. Abuse and neglect, advocating for policies, programs, representing people or doing investigations to try to eliminate abuse and neglect in our state. We advocate against the use of restraint and seclusion in schools and institutions. We are doing whatever we can to promote inclusion and access to home and community-based services rather than institutionalization for people with disabilities. Accessibility, whether that's like ADA accessibility to like a restaurant, or it's fair housing accessibility to a home, education services for students with disabilities, and representing people in cases involving employment discrimination. But again, you can go to our website to learn more about all of our priorities. Our policy priorities basically are in concert with our general priorities. We are really doing our best to advocate for policies that will enable people with disabilities to be fully participating members of their communities. That includes independent decision making, being able to vote, being able to participate fully in their communities, access to community-based services, as I said, and preventing abuse or neglect. So some examples of work that we've done policy-wise over the past several years. Back in 2021, there was a bill that my predecessor worked on, SB 134, that um, had to do with codifying supported decision-making as an alternative to guardianship. I mean, guardianship is extremely restrictive. It takes away someone's ability to make decisions for themselves. But before someone can be determined incapacitated and required to have a guardian, courts need to consider what alternatives might be put into place for, to obviate the need for guardianship. So supported decision making is one of those alternatives. It's now spelled out in our law what supported decision making is. There's a lot of information on our website about that too. Another bill that I worked on, actually, that ended up taking 2 sessions to get done correctly, was raising the eligibility for education for students with disabilities in our public schools. So up until 2022, students who turn 21, the day they turn 21, even if they hadn't graduated from high school, were tossed out of schools and were not allowed to continue getting education services. But the federal law provides for education for students with disabilities up until the day they turn 22. So our legislature in 22 passed actually 2 bills with identical language that one out of the House, one out of the Senate, which raised the eligibility age for education for students. We also worked to support 2 bills in the 2023 session, which the idea was to strengthen a law that we have that limits the use of restraint and seclusion of children in schools and facilities. So the 2 bills that the underlying law is in the PowerPoint. It's RSA 126U. The bills that we worked on more recently were, one, to make it clear that prone restraint is dangerous and prohibited. The other one, SB 179, was intended and actually has made it less likely that seclusion will be used in children. And if seclusion is used, that there be some opportunity for some therapy for children to process what happened. And also, again, really, these are about trying to not have to seclude kids or not have to restrain children in situations where there could be a therapeutic intervention to address a behavior. This most recent legislative session, one of the bills that we worked on was to establish a right to counsel for children in the foster care system who are either in institutional placements currently or at high risk of placement in those institutions. The governor signed that into law, I think about a month ago now or a few weeks ago. We also worked on, go back, we advocated for another bill that was signed into law that will require localities to provide accessible voting systems for people in all of our elections, not just federal elections. So beginning in January of 2025, local elections and local polls for local elections will have accessible voting machines so that people with disabilities who are blind or have other print disabilities will be able to vote privately and independently. So just to give you a flavor. And then, I mean, for the 2025 session, as you know, it's a budget year. So we're going to have a lot of focus on the budget and making sure that we are advocating for resources that are needed to implement some bills passed in prior sessions, like the right to counsel for children, and that there are adequate funds for the programs and services that enable people with disabilities to live successfully in their communities. I'm also really open to hearing what ideas you might have for policy related to people with disabilities and how I might be able to be of assistance with that. If you want to stay, and my email address is in the next slide, which you'll have available to you. But if you want to learn more about DRC, we have a monthly electronic newsletter, and you can sign up for that. It kind of gives you, it's not too overwhelming, but sort of tells you on the pulse, like what's finger on the pulse, what's happening right now that's important for people with disabilities. Like I said, our website has an incredible amount of information about Disability Rights Center and the services we provide, as well as a lot of information on what the current law, rules, regs are, and rights people have around disability. And feel free to reach out with any questions. And here's how to find me.
Great, thank you, Karen. This is just a quick reminder to put questions in the chat if you have them as we continue, and I'm gonna go ahead and put Zach in the spotlight to get started.
All right. Thank you, Karen. And I'm going to jump in to kind of dive into some school funding related pieces as well. And just as a reminder for anyone that was here on Tuesday, I will cover a very small amount of similar information, but then dive in a lot more to the special education funding piece of the school funding formula to kind of really tie it to some of the work that Karen and the DRC do, and some work that we've put out in reports over the past year or two. So just real quick, in case folks are not familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization based here in Concord. We're a small staff of 5, and we do presentations around the state, educating people about how our schools are funded here in New Hampshire, the lack of funding from the state, kind of the impact on property taxes, some of the history of these issues, and really trying to help people understand that there's a lot of inequitable elements to these policies. And then, trying to help people understand how to engage the legislative process, do some advocacy, and we do a lot of work, or not a lot, some work, especially heading up to a legislative session, working with representatives or hopeful elected officials around crafting bill language as well. So a few high-level pieces for folks that might not be familiar with students with disabilities who receive education through individualized education programs, otherwise known as IEPs. Just kind of a few high-level stats to help orient folks for those students in our public school system currently, or with the most recent available data from last year. Just about under 31,000 students received IEPs last year. It's almost 20% of the total public school population. And those services can range quite a bit, from as little as 30 minutes or an hour a week up to full-time placement in maybe a facility that's not in the specific school district. So it's kind of a big range in the type and breadth and amount of different services that students need. But all in all, about 20% of students received IEPs last year. State and federal government only paid about 17% of the costs associated with providing those IEPs, which was 1% less than 2022. So not moving in the right direction, and also a pretty small percentage to start with. And we'll get into kind of the breakdown of where some of that money came from, or the specific elements of that here in a little bit. And one more piece here is looking at, we look at a lot of the impact of the lack of state funding on school district budgets and local property taxpayers. And it's important to note that special education services, the state classifies those as the special education differentiated aid is the term they use. Just like services for students that are maybe living in poverty or need English classes, they cost additional money. And for a number of New Hampshire public schools last year, or 60 of them, about 25% of their budget was related to IEP expenses. So big picture, this is kind of stepping out of individual students. This is now all students in the entire public education system in the state, just kind of, again, orient where we're coming from. So last year, we spent about $3.8 billion on our public education system. It is a lot of money, and you might hear things like people saying that we spend a high amount of money per pupil relative to the rest of the country, and therefore, why do we talk about education funding? We're already spending a lot. We are spending a decent amount of money, and we do historically and currently, we are a state that really values education and does invest a lot in our public education system. The challenge is that average hides some of the deep disparities. So we do spend a good amount, but where it comes from also is pretty inequitable in its funding streams. So what this is showing is the different levels where the money is coming from, that $3.8 billion. About 9% comes from the federal government. Just under 20% comes from the state. There's a few main pockets there in green, a few elements that make up that 20%. That 20% is the lowest percentage in the entire country. So of the proportion of funding provided by the state for a public education system, K through 12 in the country, that's the lowest. We're also one of the lowest in our public higher ed, but we tend to focus on K through 12. And then the property tax piece, it's over 70%. Comes from local property taxes. That is the highest percentage in the entire country by a long shot. The reason we have it as 70% there, when the chart says 61.4%, but then we have SWEPT as well. SWEPT is a statewide education property tax. I'll get into that a little bit more in detail at one of our webinars next week, and we have a lot of resources around that as well. But as it currently stands in law, SWEPT is raised, retained, and spent locally. It is a local property tax. It doesn't, and the money never goes to the state. So we include that when we talk about the total property tax reliance to fund public schools. And what that amounts to is about $2.7 billion, that property tax piece, that's 70%. And numerous Supreme Court cases over the years have said that the state needs to define and pay for the cost of an adequate education. And yet a significant amount of money is downshifted, that responsibility is downshifted onto local property taxpayers each year. Okay, so how does this same piece look, but for costs associated with students with disabilities, special education aid? So now we're looking at the total pie for that $915 million that last year was spent on services for students with disabilities receiving those IEPs. That's a good chunk of the total amount of money spent. But look at how this shifted. 82% of that is coming from from the local school and the SWEP, so local property taxes. There's a massive reliance. We already were the highest in the country just with the 60%, 70% reliance. 82% of the funds needed to provide these critical services for students with disabilities comes from local property taxpayers. A few other pieces I'll kind of break down here for those of you that might not know what these other elements are. So first is this category called that the state calls special education differentiated aid. So this is part of the funding formula for how to pay the cost for an adequate education. I'll break that down a little bit later, but this is an amount of money given per student that qualifies for an IEP to the school district to say, hey, we recognize that these additional services cost additional funding. Here's a little extra money. So it's $61 million. There's also, not to get too confusing, but something called special education aid. It's a very similar name. This was formerly known as catastrophic aid, but it is now known as special education aid. That's the language was changed, and that's what this bucket of money is called. So special education aid is a chunk of money. It's maintained at or very close to this $33 million for a number of years now. And what it is if a student costs, the services required by a student cost X times the amount of an average per pupil expenditure. And they have a kind of a few different cutoffs, 3.5, I think it's 5, and 10 times. Then the state will kick in additional funding. There's a few caveats here, though. One is a reimbursement, right? Which for any of you that have done any budgeting, both private sector, nonprofit, government, school board, anything, getting reimbursements is way less ideal than having that funding come up front. You have to put up that cost. And second is that this pool of money gets prorated. So if there are a lot of school districts that apply and have students that qualify, if they, their costs are exceeding that 3.5 or 5 times the average cost per pupil, so they're rightfully applying for reimbursement. But there's a lot of those applications sometimes the state will just take those all allocations and prorate them to keep the total pot of money here the same. So this really is helpful to a degree, but has a lot of caveats in it. The other chunk is money from the federal government. This came up quite a bit in the last legislative session. And if there are questions around this, I might be able to answer them, and then I might have to lean on Karen a little bit too. But there is money that does come from the federal government. And it is true that they should be paying more. They have chronically underfunded the amount of money that the federal government said they would provide for public education for students with disabilities who need these special education services, right? That is true. It's a small piece. And Medicaid also has reduced in recent years. So altogether, you can see that these elements provide less than 20% of the total amount of costs needed to provide these services for students. And the result of that, similar to the previous chart, is that $750 million of this total 915 is paid for by local property taxpayers. So to dig in a little bit to this adequacy formula I've mentioned, this will look familiar to folks that were on the call on Tuesday. This is the states, how they calculate the cost of an adequate education. Every student gets $4,100 in base adequacy. If you qualify for free and reduced price meals, which is used as a proxy measure for poverty, because that's the kind of a measure, it's not the best measure we have right now for students living in poverty, you get an additional $2,300. Right? That's an acknowledgement from the state that students living in poverty, in general, on average, require additional services that cost additional money. So a little extra money for students who qualify at that federal poverty line. Then there's an additional amount of money for students receiving special education services who have IEPs, who qualify for different services, right? $2,100. And then another $800 for students who qualify as English language learners. But if you add in some of the other additional aid categories from the state to give them credit, right, it still only gets the average amount for students with disabilities who have IEPs up to about $3,000 per student. So just like for the full funding picture, right, these special education costs are largely paid for by local property taxpayers. So again, this might look familiar. This is kind of showing you the gap here. So we have the average amount of money that the state is contributing per student here, and then the actual per pupil expenditures. No community in the state comes even close to operating their public school just with the adequacy funding provided by the state. And remember, that's the funding that the state has said, here's the amount of money you need to provide an adequate education. It is wildly inadequate for what the actual costs are. The closest, Manchester is one of the closest communities. They largely can do that because of the volume of students. They have the largest school district in the state, and they still spend almost about three times as much as they get in adequacy funding from the state. So coming back to the impact of the the services needed for students with IEPs and the lack of funding from the state. Here is the 10 districts last year that saw the largest percent increase in their cost for students, cost for these services, the IEP services for students with disabilities last year. And I want to spend a little bit on this because I think this can be taken a few different ways. First, it's important to remember that a lot of these services are required by state and federal law and school rule. They also are critically important for students to be able to have access to an opportunity for an adequate education just like their peers. That being said, they also can, there can be expenses and services that are pretty volatile year to year. Remember I mentioned that state special education aid earlier is on a reimbursement system. If you see some of the districts here, and every district here, except for Kentucky Valley, has a student population of under 300. So in general, they're smaller student populations. One of the results can be if you have a handful of students that enter into a school system or maybe move up from a middle school to a high school, for whatever reason, there's a lot of movement around different schools and districts around the state. that require additional services that the school district didn't have on their budget books the year before. It can create some serious volatility, especially in smaller schools. And this creates a really awful tension at the local level. Because we rely so heavily on local property taxes, a lot of times the only place really where a school district can turn to is the local property taxpayers to increase the amount of funding they need to provide these really important services for students with disabilities and for all their students, right? But what we can see here is sometimes that volatility can really play out in more personal terms, because in a small community, you might know which family has a student that is requiring these additional services. And no student or family should be under that pressure of needing access to those services to succeed in their public school, and then also knowing that their property taxpayers of their neighbors might go up because of that. And there's both a failure of a lack of funding from the state and such a heavy reliance on local property taxes. And this is from a paper we produced last year. We'll make sure to send out a copy of that in the follow-up email with the recording and everything. And part of who is paying for this, right? And why that volatility, both for when zeroing in really on students with disabilities and the services relative to IEPs, but also the larger public education system in general, is that it contributes to a very regressive tax system. This is showing the groups shares of income by group from lowest on the left to highest on the right. Highest on the right is over $700,000. Lowest is making less than $35,000. And what you see here is property taxes, largely driven by our school funding system. Also some municipal elements as well. In general, the less money you make, in general, the higher amount goes to property taxes. And this modeling by the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy, property taxes also includes modeling for rent. So even for renters, they try to incorporate the impact of property taxes as it's passed down to increased rent. And as I'm heading kind of towards the last section here, similar to what Karen was doing, looking at advocacy and policy, some of the things they've been doing at the legislative level to address the issues that they work on. This is really important because how we talk about, especially heading into a budget year, right? There's going to be a lot of conversations about what we have the resources, what we have the money to pay for, right? And when we make decisions about how we're raising revenue, it impacts the state level, right? It also impacts all the way down into the local level in these local school board decisions. So one thing I'll point out is that coming up in 2025 here, we're fully phasing out our interest and dividends tax. It was billed as a cut for retired elderly folks who are living on fixed incomes, are just making a little bit of money off of interest from savings that they've built up over their careers and their lives. The reality is, and this is this national group that does taxation and economic policy work around the country, this is the actual impact of cutting the interest and dividends tax. The largest relief will be felt by folks who are in general making over $300,000. The Fiscal Policy Institute estimated that to actually really feel the impact of this tax cut, you're having between $3 and $10 million invested in wealth to be generating interest on that's actually taxed by this tax. So we're phasing out some significant revenue sources, heading into a budget year, and now there's going to be even harder conversations about what the state has the ability to afford, and who's going to pay for that. And looking at the system here, it's going to hopefully, part of what we'll be advocating for is to not continue that reliance and that push down onto property taxpayers. So a few pieces of legislation heading towards the end here that we focused on. I added in a little more information to the slide from the other day, specifically relative to the special education differentiated aid category here. So here are 4 bills we were following. The first one was a bill related to the Conval lawsuit, just increased base adequacy, the amount of funding for every student. The second one here, though, we've now kind of dug into quite a bit more. So this would increase that special education differentiated aid, right, which is the term for the amount of additional funding that the state gives to each school district for those students with disabilities who qualify and have IEPs. Right now, that's that $2,100 per student. This bill would have increased it to, at the time, the actual average additional costs, right? And averages are an imperfect metric, but they're helpful. Not every student needs $27,000 per student, every year, right? But on average, that's the additional costs associated with some of the services provided for these students. It would have been about an $800 million shift from local property taxpayers, if you keep everything else equal, to the state to provide those services. HB 1670, frankly, was pretty complicated, but was a different way of getting at the same issue as HB 1656. And then HB 1586 was kind of a total rewrite of the education funding formula. I'm pointing this out to kind of show some of the challenges that are faced in the legislative process. So we go from HB 1656, a bill that was trying to look at what are some of the true costs, what are some of the actual elements in providing these services for students with disabilities. We go from $800 million to $17 million. Not that that's not nothing, right? But that is a significant drop in the amount of funding that would provide actual relief for communities around the state and help provide these services for these students. That was in the House, dropped it down to $17 million. Also added in a number of provisions that would not have been helpful for students with disabilities and the administration of that program. And then one more step, a few of these passed the House, 2 of them did not. Even an increase in $17 million ended up getting effectively killed in the Senate. And part of the argument made was it's not a budget year, so we shouldn't be talking about how to spend additional funding, right? Other things are funded, we're cutting revenue sources. So heading into this next budget year, it's going to be really important to take a look at what are the actual costs and who is paying them right now and who can afford to pay more, which is in general not local property taxpayers. So with that, I'll end there. And I just want to remind folks to put questions in the chat. We have about 15 minutes to answer questions for both Karen and I, and really appreciate you all being here. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Awesome. Thank you, Zach. Let me just get you out of, oh, I guess I'll put you and Karen both in the spotlight as we do Q&A. All right, so Karen, I've got a couple of questions for you that we can get started with. What kind of criteria do you require to be eligible as developmentally disabled in New Hampshire? And kind of in that same vein, could you talk a little bit about what qualifies as a disability?
So, if you're talking, I guess if the narrow question had to do about a developmental disability, I'm assuming that the person asking wanted to know about developmental disability as an eligibility criteria for developmental services in this state. So because there are specific definitions of disability in sort of different areas that you might qualify for services and for our office or for housing or for education. So as far as a developmental disability goes, we have state rules that set that definition. In general, I actually pulled it up. It has to do with having a condition that is attributable to an intellectual disability or cerebral palsy, epilepsy, autism, or a specific learning disability, or any other condition that is closely related to intellectual disability. It doesn't have to be like a particular IQ number, for example, but it is basically a condition that will impact someone's general intellectual functioning, or it would impair someone's adaptive behavior, or have them require treatment or an intervention that is required for people with intellectual disabilities. It has to be something that the person obtained or before they reach the age of 22. And it has to be a condition that can be expected to continue indefinitely, and is severe, so that it actually would impact a person's ability to function in society without having some services in place. That is a very narrow definition to qualify for developmental services. There are other definitions of disability that apply to, say, access to special education. So our state and federal laws define what that looks like. And basically, those laws establish, I think it's about 13 different categories or conditions that a student might be diagnosed with, which range from physical impairments that could include being blind. I just thought being gifted does not qualify someone for special ed. No. So being blind, having an intellectual disability, having an emotional behavioral disability, it could be an orthopedic impairment. There's a whole list. And because of that disability, the student requires special education or related services, which range from speech language therapy, occupational therapy, counseling, behavioral supports, in order to obtain an adequate education or an appropriate education. There's also definitions for disability under the ADA or Section 504 of the Federal Rehabilitation Act, which look at any kind of physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And major life activities are defined really broadly. So that could be, sleeping, eating, working. So it, like I said, it depends on, what it is, what service the person is trying to obtain. For our office, we're gonna cast a wide net. So if someone call our office, if you identify as having a disability, just call us and we can help sort through all of that, depending what the legal issue is.
Great. Karen, I have one more for you, and then we'll move over to Zach. With such little funding coming from the state, has the Disability Rights Center seen the impacts in public schools for students who aren't receiving their required disability services? And are schools getting sued because they can't afford to educate their students with disabilities?
Well, so yes, we have seen clients directly impacted by the lack of funding, and also sort of what goes hand in hand with that is a workforce shortage and lack of funding, making it difficult for schools to offer salaries that are high enough to attract qualified workers to provide some of the services that students need. Um, and so we've heard about cases where students are, have their individualized education programs, or IEPs, might call for a service, which could range from having a paraprofessional maybe with them to help guide them through and support them throughout the day, or to having a related service like speech language therapy, that kind of stuff. And they just don't get it. And the schools, in some cases, are trying to provide the service. Oh, school nursing services is one that we see a lot for students who have medical issues and need school nursing in order to be able to attend school. And schools are really struggling to fulfill students' needs. Are they being sued? I think that as far as education goes for students with disabilities, there is an administrative hearing process that has to be implemented before someone would go to court. So I think I am aware of some cases where parents are bringing what we call due process. That's the administrative proceeding. If a school district is not doing what it ought to be doing to meet a child's needs, child who qualifies for an IEP. So I am aware of schools being, not really sued, but there are complaints being filed against them through this due process procedure. Also, Zach, just one thing I think that you had mentioned is that, the amount of money that the federal government can pay for special education. So the federal law that establishes special education, called IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, authorizes appropriations of up to 40% of the average per pupil spending for special education. However, the federal government has never even come close to appropriating that figure. But so it's really fallen on states to have to do this, and it's required. This is not an optional service. This is
Right.
a service that's required.
Thank you. Thank you. I thought you'd have a little more detail on that.
All right, thank you, Karen. Zach, what is the effect of the New Hampshire Supreme Court declaring SWEPT unconstitutional?
The Supreme Court has not, if you're referring to the Rand lawsuit, the Supreme Court has not declared it unconstitutional. The Superior Court has. And that happened last November. The state and the coalition communities, which is a coalition of 26 property wealthy communities that have joined the state in that effort. They both appealed that to the Supreme Court, and that is still pending up there. The briefs in that actually were just released late last night. Nothing groundbreaking, but so the Superior Court has said it's unconstitutional, but like there's no effect right now because the Supreme Court said, hold on, don't change anything. We're gonna wait until we've gotten to hear it. And so it's at that Supreme Court level right now.
Okay. Has the federal government sorry, this is worded a little bit worded trickily. Has the federal government, who has created some mandates that you talked about, Zach, ever taken financial or fiscal responsibility in funding?
I think Karen just answered that in the sense of like they've authorized up to 40%, but have never come close to that. Although I will point out that that was used this last session as kind of a scapegoat of sorts, effectively saying, why should we need to try to figure out how to pay for these services locally when the federal government's the one that, you know, sets some of these laws and regulations, and then they've never fully funded the amount they said they would. And so we should spend our time kind of advocating at the federal level. I think both can be true, but I think it's also unrealistic to think that the federal government's just going to turn around and be like, oh, shoot, sorry, you're right. Here's double the amount of money we've been giving for decades. So I think both can be true. It's worth, you know, trying to see if they can get more funding, but also recognizing that we have some serious inequities in the way we fund at the state level that we can be addressing at the same time. And I don't know if Karen, if you have additional thoughts on
Well, I mean, I guess the other thing to think about is that our states and localities that offer education services have to do it in a way that's not discriminatory. And students who experience a disability may require accommodations, modifications, and special education and related services in order to actually have an opportunity to obtain the same benefit that students who don't have those challenges have. So, you know, if I think we all agree that public education and is a very important service. It's very important that we have an educated citizenry, and our schools need to meet the needs of everyone. And so that would include students with disabilities and, you know, who may cost more to educate.
Right. Zach, what realistic strategies have been offered to change how New Hampshire funds education, and how can we move away from property taxes as the principal revenue generator?
Well, that is in part why we exist as an organization, is that this is a very challenging area. So I'll kind of give a broad answer and let me know if I don't hit it. But I guess realistic depends on kind of your perspective. I think in general, New Hampshire, the overwhelming assumption is that we're not allowed to talk about a lot of other revenue sources, specifically income and sales taxes. You know, people feel very strongly, especially in the political world, that part of, you know, the New Hampshire advantage, if you will, that term, is that we don't have these broad-based taxes. What we do have, though, is a lot of income and sales specific taxes that we hide in a lot of other places. So we do pay those types of taxes, they're just hidden and not broad-based. A lot of conversations in the past 10 or 15 years have not been about fundamental reform. They've been about tweaking little pieces, right? So let's add $50 million here. Let's add $100 million here, but then the next budget, it goes away. Let's, you know, tweak the special education aid piece a little bit, but not actually expand it to be comprehensive and the amount of funding that's needed. This past session, there was a few bills that I put up on this slide that would have, you know, provide a lot more funding, but did not have the revenue elements associated with them. I know this is kind of high level, but I guess the short answer is in both parties for decades, there has been very little appetite to seriously publicly consider in the legislative process large scale tax and funding reform for our schools and how we pay for our schools. It is kind of conventionally understood that that is not something you do as an elected official because it's too much, too big, too fast. But the effects are a lot of people who cannot afford to pay more year after year, the property taxes, and especially in the past few years with the housing market and the renting market going crazy after the pandemic, people are feeling that even more. So I'm optimistic they'll have some more kind of like honest conversations. I'm not a tax policy expert. I know some stuff, but they're like part of the value in this is having these debates and conversations saying, who would benefit from changing our tax structure in what ways? How would we adjust business taxes or the interest in dividends? Could we do a homestead exemption? So if someone's living in a property wealthy community but has been living there for 3 decades, right? They might not be wealthy themselves. So how do we make sure that they are taken care of and that if we are adjusting the property tax, for example, that's something that they're not paying more if they can't afford it. So kind of a high level answer. There's been some proposals in recent years, but we're really hoping to kind of like keep driving, keep pushing from an advocacy perspective to have more honest and conversations about that. I'm curious if Karen has thoughts on
I
it.
think, I mean, one other consideration that I think just bears some thought is the impact of education freedom accounts
Yes.
on our local schools. And I think, this is a really controversial topic, and people have very strong opinions about choice and where these funds go and what kind of oversight these funds have. But I think it does bear some really careful, it warrants some careful consideration because those are funds that are already available for education, to pay for education. And those funds are being utilized in a particular way. So they're being given to benefit individual children, not necessarily in our public schools. So I think it's just important to think about that and think about education policy and think about what public education is and what the role of government is in supporting education. And I mean, there are pros and cons, but it does have the more we allow, the more the state supports taking these funds out of our public schools and putting them towards individual children's and parents' choice, it does have an impact on the public schools that localities are required to offer for everyone. And from a disability rights perspective, it's important to note that children with disabilities are only entitled under federal and state law to get the services that they need for an appropriate education if they are enrolled in their local school districts. So, and in order to benefit from the education freedom account, the parent needs to withdraw their student from the school. So those children are then not entitled to special education and related services and implementation of their IEPs. So what I sometimes see, if schools are small particularly and there's a lot of money flowing out, it makes it even more difficult
Mhm.
for our local schools to meet the needs of the students with disabilities who really are going to sacrifice their rights to appropriate education if they withdraw from school.
All right. That brings us to 1 o'clock, so we will go ahead and wrap things up. Thank you, Zach and Karen. Karen, thank you so much for participating in these with us and including the Disability Rights Center in these webinars. I will
Thank
be
you.
sending out an email to everybody this afternoon that will have a link to the slide decks, the recording of this webinar, and Zach and Karen's contact information if you have any additional questions that we didn't answer this afternoon. And Zach and Karen, I'll pass it right back over to you if you have anything that you'd like to leave folks with before we close this out.
just thank you all for giving us the time to address you all. If you've got questions, my email address is in the PowerPoint. Feel free to reach out. I really have to say I admire everyone who chooses to run for office and to actually be in office in this state. It's really a full-time job for a lot of folks who work really hard and are just so dedicated. And I'm always impressed with the people I meet at the LOB and at the State House, and really appreciative to what you all do.
Likewise, yeah, thank you for both running and also for taking your time today to come listen, learn about these different elements. And please, 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 if you have questions for myself or Karen or our teams generally, please reach out. We definitely want to be a service and a resource for you. So appreciate you all coming and hope to see you at some of the future ones in the coming weeks.